and we'll resume. These sort of conversations are the conversations I hope you'll be having for much of the rest of this week, to pause and to share ideas with one another. So I hope you get much more of a chance to do that together. I wonder what methods you came up with, and perhaps I will find out about some of them over our break in a moment. Let's talk about this second example, which is creative councils. I think you call them councils here as well. So creative local authorities, local government institutions. Now, this is a program that Nesta ran over the last couple of years, where we looked for some particularly inspiring local government innovators who wanted to do things differently. And we put out a call to say, well, what is it that's the most pressing need that you are facing? And some people told us it was creating their own energy source. Other people said it was the aging population. Others said it was the prospects of those children who have no parents and are looked after by the state government. And we asked them, well, tell us what's your most pressing need, and then together, over 2 years, we will innovate, come up with something new, test it out, and then roll it out into your local government. And so let me show you a short video of that process. Perhaps we'll be able to do this.
Councils across England and Wales are experiencing unprecedented upheaval. Budgets are falling, while demands from
It worked perfectly in rehearsal. So it was the way, right? Maybe not. Don't worry if not. It should be working. Yeah. Don't worry. Well, I'll tell you what the video would have said. It would have been much more exciting. There would have been background music and different voices, so I'm sorry I can't do those. But this program, which ran over 2 years, looked to support innovators, and in particular we did that by finding the people who wanted to make a difference, helping them to talk to their citizens, prototype, test things out, and then getting their chief executive or their politician, their lead politician involved, so that they were bought in to creating space to try something new, to take a few risks. And two of the examples that struck me most from this, so the first is Derbyshire County Council. Here they were very worried about those children who were leaving care, so were looked after by the state because their parents weren't able to look after them. And what happened at 16, 17, 18 years old is that they were more likely to end up in prison, more likely to end up without a job, more likely to be struggling with their health than if they were brought up by parents in a community. And this struck the local authority as shameful, really. Why is it that those children who are being looked after by the states should have so much worse outcomes? And so the local authority looked at all of the money that they spent on taking care of these children and thought, what if we spent some of that money differently? What if we created an endowment, a small resource which the young people were able to tap into, so that these young people got access to the same sort of privileges that you or I might have had when we turned 18 as well. So perhaps your parents bought you an old car, not worth very much money, but able to get you from A to B. Or perhaps they helped to pay your university tuition fees to be able to go to university. Perhaps they let you live in their house without paying any rent for a few months while you found your first job. And so this endowment they created was to enable all children who'd been brought up in care to have access to those same sort of privileges. Now, one of the key things from them was the space to be able to take risks. This is a tricky subject. The journalists would get involved and wonder what's happening. Politicians would have to stand on a platform and justify spending money on these things. And so we ran a series of camps, of conferences where people's chief executives had to come with them. They had to talk through the idea and get bought into the idea. And then they made a public statement that they were going to try something differently, just for a very short period. And if it works, brilliant, we'll do it for much longer. And if it doesn't, please forgive us, but we must experiment. We must try and take risks. And so Nesta was able to give Derbyshire a small amount of money to help the process, but most importantly was creating this space to take risks. And that was very much done by the local leadership of the authority. That's on the camps. The second part that was very important is this idea of prototyping, really skilling up on the methods of what it means to prototype. So the city of Stoke-on-Trent was another of our creative councils. And this is a traditional industrial town, had grown up through creating a lot of pottery, which there is no longer a big demand for. And so it was struggling, lots and lots of people out of work, very high living costs, really difficult city. And what they decided would really change things is if they owned and produced energy locally. So rather than being subject to fluctuating oil prices from the Middle East or the gas pipeline that comes from Russia to the UK, they would generate their own energy, they'd store it, they'd sell some of it to make money, but also they'd be able to offer local businesses very cheap rates. They'd be able to offer local people very cheap rates. So the cost of living goes down and the economy improves. And so they've established their own energy provider, whereas across the rest of the UK, everything is nationalised. There are big national companies. Here, they have their own provider. They're generating electricity in renewable ways, and they're storing it and selling it at very cheap rates to improve the economy. And for them, it was the skill of prototyping, working out how they could test each part of this function. The same for Derbyshire, where they're thinking about children in care. How do we get citizens involved, and how do we prototype? And we have a saying at Nesta, which is fail fast, fail cheap, and fail forward. So if you're going to test out something brand new, it may not always work. So first of all, accepting that you might fail is important. But if you are going to fail, it seems like it's important to fail very quickly. So don't take your time over it. No one's going to give you any merit for that. So testing things out using paper prototyping, so being able to draw it or design it or perhaps model it. We could role play and you could take on the role of a citizen and I would be the public servant and we could see what the interaction would look like. Then perhaps we would create an office that ran this new system just for a week or for 4 weeks to test something out. So failing fast is important. Failing cheaply is also important. So don't spend lots of money on it. Try things out with post-it notes. We often model new spaces and services with Lego men to see what the interactions would look like before we go on to build a whole new building or to design a whole new set. And then fail forward. So the key thing is, if it's not going to work, what can you learn going forward? Rather than saying failure takes you a step back, we think in the innovation game, particularly with prototyping, failure is about moving forward, learning from those mistakes. And some of the skills of prototyping, I'm sure you'll be able to access through the workshops this week. But in particular, I think it's good to get this methodology down. If you're wondering, how can I innovate in my service or my department, having the skills to prototype, to draw out, to design a new solution, and then to help people engage in testing it, we found to be one of the most critical service design skills, or one of the most critical innovation skills for public servants. So yeah, worth having a go at that this week if you get a chance. So final example from me is the Centre for Social Action. This is a particular program that we're running at the moment that is all about bringing citizens, bringing communities into public services. For too long in the UK, we've seen public services as an institution on the hill, behind the town hall, and they do things for citizens, and communities or individuals as the recipients of those services. And that fundamental relationship needs to change, particularly over the next couple of years. Now, that's partly driven by money, by economics. Government has less money. But I think most importantly, it's driven by better outcomes. So when someone goes into a hospital and they're given a medical intervention, and perhaps they're an isolated older person, they are less likely to spend money on future medical interventions if a volunteer comes with them and takes them home after they come out of hospital, and make sure they're settled in and they've got access to foods, they know where things are, perhaps if their mobility is impaired. Equally, we think that people get better outcomes if when they're diagnosed with a disease like diabetes, they're given some drugs, they're given a particular intervention, but also they're told the name of someone else who has diabetes, who lives locally, who they could have a conversation with and say, well, how do you manage your diet? Or how do you cope when you go out for dinner with people? Or how do you find that the drugs affect your behavior? And they can have a conversation in a community. We find that people recover faster, students learn quicker, etc., etc. People get much, much better outcomes. And so we've established a grant fund, and so far we've backed about 40 different innovations with money to be able to empower these sort of relationships between the citizen and the state. And in particular, we only back people with evidence. So we're very clear. If this is a little bit further around the spiral, so it's not about prototyping something new. What we want is innovations that we know work. Then we must know beyond all doubt that they're definitely leading to a better outcome for people. Now, often when I talk about innovation, people imagine that I'm going to be talking about technology or about this sort of traditional research and development. And when I tell them that I'm spending money on innovation, which is about helping older people to live well or young people to find a job, then I think this is what's going through their mind. They think it's fluffy. They think it's soft, it's cuddly, it's cute, but it's not really necessary. And innovation isn't fluffy. We think that innovation is hard. It's about evidence of what works. And so at Nesta, we've been using these standards of evidence. If you want to get money from us to scale up your innovation, then we are telling people you must have certain standards of evidence. So at level 1, you must be able to give me your theory of change, to tell me logically and coherently why what you're doing will really lead to a change for someone else. At level 2, I'd expect you to be able to tell me that people like your service, that they self-report that perhaps they've got better quicker, or that they've felt more empowered, or that their well-being has been improved, so that people are enjoying the service. But critically, to get money really from me at Nesta, you must have level 3 evidence. So you must have a control group which suggests that your way of working is better than the existing way of working. Now, that can be hard to do in public services because that means that we have to create a comparison group, someone who isn't getting the new service, the new system. And so we need to be careful about the ethics of how we make these control groups work. But we think that it's possible for the majority of services to have a comparison or a control group where we can say, well, when you received this intervention, your exam results at school or your number of days in hospital went up or down by this much. But when you received this other intervention, in comparison, there was a much better change or a much greater change. And so we've been using this framework, these standards of evidence, to invest in innovations, to give grants to specific innovations. And again, this is much further around the spiral than prototyping or testing new ideas. It's into how do you embed the very best ideas. So we've been backing organisations like City Year, which send in 18-year-olds wearing red jumpers to go and assist young people in schools who are falling behind. And they do that as a year of service. This young person in the red jumper is a volunteer. They're giving their time to a state institution, to a school, for free. But they're helping this young person to learn differently. And in particular, we're helping City Year to scale. So how can they not just be in 5 schools, but how can they be in all schools across the UK? And we think evidence is a key part of that. And then the second example is called Shared Lives Plus. Now, in the UK, many older people, when they can't live in their own home any longer, will not go to live with a family member. Rather, they'll go to live in an institution, so a care home or something similar. And we know that people don't get such good outcomes. They don't tend to live as long. They aren't as happy when that happens, but it just kind of is the way that public services work. And the state will pay for their accommodation in this care home. And so Shared Lives Plus matches older people who don't really want to go into a care home with a family who would like them to come and live with them. So it's not their own family, it's another family. It's essentially like adoption. Now, 100 years ago, adoption was not normal in the UK at all. People weren't paid by the state to adopt a child. It just was a completely different way of working. And yet now, that's a very normal process. We consider that completely normal. And so we think, in a similar way, in 10 years' time in the UK, adopting an older person, having them come live with you, having a relationship with the state where you receive a small stipend for having an older person live in your home, will be a very normal process, a very normal way of having public services operate. But again, that requires us to operate on the fringe between government and community. And that's my key message for these examples, is that we have found that the space for innovation is most ripe, most fruitful on the fringe between public services and the community. And so I wonder about your examples where you might connect. And so, perhaps we'll think about that for a moment. We also find that it's very hard to stop doing what you do now. So this is a Turner painting of someone decommissioning an old ship. And I think that one of the most difficult things in local government about innovation is not coming up with something new. We're all here because we believe in the ideas, the good new ideas, but actually stopping doing the old service. And again, we found that this is more likely to happen on this fringe between local government and the community. So just before I finish, perhaps you will turn again to a different person this time. You must promise me you'll talk to a different person. And for 2 minutes, you can ask them this question. Which are the areas in your service or department which are most open to innovation? So I'm saying in the UK, it's the services where there's some sort of connection and interaction between the community and local government. So for 2 minutes, turn to a different person, perhaps look forwards or look backwards, and